some secrets are meant to stay buried. In the records room of the Harrison County Courthouse, there existed a leather-bound ledger that documented every transaction, every sale, every transfer of property at Bellarive Plantation. For decades, this document sat untouched on dusty shelves, a mundane administrative record among thousands. But in the spring of 1891, Judge Theodore Harriman entered that room alone, late at night, and when he emerged 3 hours later, the ledger was gone. What was written in those pages? Why would a respected judge risk everything to destroy public records? And which families whose names still grace banks, courthouses, and universities today, were so desperate to erase their connection to Bellarive that they would orchestrate one of the most calculated cover-ups in Southern history? This is not a ghost story. This is a story about power, about the lengths people will go to protect their legacies, and about the men and women who refuse to let the truth disappear, even when silence would have been so much safer. Benjamin Walsh had worked at the Harrison County Courthouse for 11 years. He was not an ambitious man. At 34 years old, he had settled into the comfortable rhythm of a records clerk, filing deeds, transcribing wills, organizing the endless paper trail that documented life and death in Mississippi. He wore the same gray vest every day, kept his lunch in a tin pail, and walked the same route home each evening. It was this predictability, this attention to mundane detail, that made him notice when something was wrong. The morning of April 14, 1891 began like any other. Benjamin arrived at 7 o'clock, unlocked the records room, and began his daily inventory. The courthouse required all clerks to maintain meticulous logs. Every document borrowed, every file accessed, every ledger removed had to be recorded with a signature and timestamp. The night log sat on the desk, where the evening clerk always left it. Benjamin picked it up, expecting to see it blank. The courthouse closed at 6. No one should have been in the records room after hours. But there, in careful handwriting, was a single entry. April 13, 1891, 11:47 p.m. Judge T. Harriman, Property Records, Bellarive Plantation, 1855-1868. Returned, 2:33 a.m. Benjamin read the entry 3 times. Judge Harriman had spent nearly 3 hours reviewing old plantation records in the middle of the night. It made no sense. Bellarive had been abandoned for over 20 years. The plantation house had burned in 1869, and the land had been divided and sold off in pieces throughout the 1870s. There was no active litigation concerning the property, no reason for a judge to review those records, especially not at midnight. Benjamin walked to Section K, where pre-war plantation documents were stored. He found the shelf easily enough. There was a gap where the Bellarive ledger should have been, but the ledger itself was nowhere in sight. His stomach tightened. He checked the return log. Nothing. The book hadn't been officially checked back in, despite Judge Harriman's notation that he'd returned it at 2:33 a.m. Benjamin stood in the quiet records room, dust particles floating through shafts of morning light, and felt the first whisper of something wrong. In 11 years, he had never known Judge Harriman to access records personally. Judges sent clerks. Judges made requests through proper channels. And judges certainly didn't visit the courthouse alone at midnight. He could ignore this. He could pretend he hadn't noticed. But Benjamin Walsh was a man who believed in order, in the proper place of things. A missing ledger was disorder, and disorder demanded correction. Theodore Harriman was not a man people questioned. At 56 years old, he had served on the circuit court bench for 18 years. He came from old Mississippi stock. His grandfather had been a senator, his father a decorated colonel in the Mexican War. The Harriman name appeared on hospital wings and library dedications. Judge Harriman himself lived in a stately home on Magnolia Avenue, attended First Presbyterian Church, and was known for his fair but firm judgments. He was also known for something else: his friendship with the most influential families in 3 counties. When Benjamin Walsh approached his supervisor, Mr. Gerald Pitts, about the missing ledger, Pitts barely looked up from his desk. "Judge Harriman is conducting research for an upcoming case," Pitts said dismissively. "What case?" Benjamin asked. "That's not your concern." The ledger wasn't returned to its proper location. "The log shows, Mr. Walsh." Pitt set down his pen and looked at Benjamin with the expression of a man explaining basic arithmetic to a slow child. "Judge Harriman is a respected member of this court. If he needed to review documents, I'm certain he had good reason. Your job is to file papers, not interrogate judges about their work. Is that understood?" Benjamin understood perfectly. He understood that his supervisor was afraid. That evening, Benjamin did something he had never done before. Instead of walking straight home, he turned down Commerce Street and headed toward the Harrison County Library. If he couldn't access the courthouse's old newspapers directly, they were kept in a locked archive. Perhaps the library's collection would tell him something about Bellerive Plantation. The library was quiet, nearly empty. Miss Sarah Duchamps, the head librarian, was a rail-thin woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. She had worked at the library for 37 years and had read more of Harrison County's history than anyone alive. "Bellerive?" she repeated when Benjamin made his inquiry. Her expression shifted, something guarded entering her eyes. "That's a name I haven't heard in some time. I'm researching property records," Benjamin said carefully. "For the courthouse." Miss Duchamp studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded and disappeared into the stacks. She returned carrying 3 bound volumes of the Harrison Gazette dating from 1855 to 1870. "You'll want to start with August 1855, she said quietly. "That's when Bellerive was established, and then—" She paused, her finger hovering over the spine of the 3rd volume. "You'll want to pay attention to the years between 1863 and 1868. Those years are complicated." Benjamin thanked her and carried the volumes to a reading table in the corner. He opened the 1st volume and began to read. Bellerive Plantation had been established by a French Creole family named Devereux in 1855. According to the newspaper accounts, it was a modest operation compared to the massive cotton empires along the Mississippi River, only 800 acres with about 60 enslaved workers. The plantation changed hands in 1859, purchased by a consortium described only as private investors from New Orleans. The newspaper article was brief, almost dismissive. No names were listed. Benjamin flipped forward, skimming through reports of cotton yields, market prices, social events. Bellerive appeared occasionally, but always vaguely. The plantation seemed to exist in the background of Harrison County life, noted but never examined. Then came 1863. The war had reached Mississippi. Federal forces controlled much of the river. The Confederate economy was collapsing. And in the October 1863 edition of the Harrison Gazette, Benjamin found a small notice buried on page 7. "It has come to the attention of local authorities that certain irregularities exist in the management of Bellerive Plantation. An investigation has been initiated by the Confederate Treasury Department regarding discrepancies in reported cotton yields and tax assessments. Further information will be provided as developments warrant." No follow-up article ever appeared. Benjamin's pulse quickened. He leaned closer to the yellowed newsprint. Treasury investigation? What kind of irregularities? And why was there no resolution reported? He continued reading. The war years were chaotic in the newspaper. Reports of battles, casualty lists, desperate calls for supplies. But Bellerive never appeared again until May 1865, right after the surrender. "Property at Bellerive Plantation has been placed under federal oversight pending resolution of ownership disputes. Former residents are advised to present claims to the Freedmen's Bureau office in Natchez." Former residents. That was the newspaper's delicate term for people who had been enslaved. Benjamin felt something cold settling in his chest. Ownership disputes meant that the enslaved people at Bellerive were trying to claim land, trying to prove they had rights to the property. It meant there was documentation, evidence, legal basis for their claims. He flipped forward desperately now, searching for more information. There, June 1867. "The Circuit Court has ruled against claims filed by former residents of Bellerive Plantation. Judge Victor Lansfield determined that insufficient documentation exists to support land transfer assertions. The property will be liquidated and sold at public auction. Judge Lansfield noted that while the claimant's circumstances elicit sympathy, the law requires clear evidence of ownership agreements, which has not been satisfactorily provided. Benjamin sat back in his chair. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, but it was a picture with crucial elements missing. The enslaved people at Bellerive had tried to claim the land. They must have had some basis for this, documents, agreements, something that made them believe they had legal rights. But the judge ruled against them because they couldn't provide sufficient evidence. What if the evidence had existed? What if it had been in that ledger? And what if powerful families, the private investors from New Orleans who had purchased Bellerive in 1859, had something to hide about their ownership, about what happened at that plantation during and after the war? Benjamin closed the newspaper volumes. His hands were trembling slightly. Miss Duchamps appeared beside his table so quietly he startled. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked. "I found questions," Benjamin said carefully. Miss Duchamp glanced around the empty library. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My brother worked at the Freedmen's Bureau office in 1866. He said the Bellerive case was the strangest he ever encountered. The people who filed claims weren't asking for charity or reparations. They had specific information, dates, names, transactions. They said they'd been promised land, that agreements had been made. But when they went to court, all the documentation had vanished. The plantation owner's records, the sale documents, everything. The only things left were tax assessments and basic property boundaries." "Who owned Bellerive?" Benjamin asked. "Who were these investors?" Miss Duchamp shook her head. "My brother tried to find out. He sent inquiries to New Orleans, to the land office, to the War Department. He never received straight answers. And then—" She paused. "Then he was transferred to Alabama very suddenly. He wrote to me once after that, told me to let Bellerive rest, said some doors were better left closed." Benjamin felt the weight of her warning, but he also felt something else, a burning need to understand what Judge Harriman had been trying to hide. Benjamin's boarding house sat on a quiet street lined with oak trees. He rented a single room on the second floor, modest, clean, with a narrow bed, a writing desk, and a window overlooking the street. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, watching shadows move across the ceiling, thinking about ledgers and missing documents and judges who visited courthouses at midnight. Around 2 in the morning he heard it. Footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps climbing to the second floor. The boarding house had 4 rooms on this level. Benjamin's was at the end of the hall. The footsteps passed the first room, the second room, the third room. They stopped outside his door. Benjamin's heart hammered. He sat up slowly, quietly, his eyes fixed on the door handle. In the dim light filtering through his window, he watched it begin to turn. He was on his feet instantly, grabbing the wooden chair from his desk. "Who's there?" he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The door handle stopped moving. There was a long silence. Then a voice, male, low, carefully controlled. "Mr. Walsh, I strongly advise you to focus on your courthouse duties and nothing more. Curiosity about old records can lead to unfortunate complications." "Who are you?" Benjamin demanded. No answer. The footsteps retreated down the hallway, descending the stairs. By the time Benjamin pulled open his door and looked out, the hallway was empty. He didn't sleep the rest of that night. Benjamin knew he couldn't do this alone. If he was going to pursue this, and some stubborn part of him insisted that he must, he needed someone he could trust. He thought of Lydia Mathis. Lydia was a teacher at the Harrison County School for Colored Children. Benjamin had met her 2 years earlier when she'd come to the courthouse to file a complaint about unsafe conditions at the school building. While other clerks had dismissed her, Benjamin had helped her navigate the bureaucracy, had shown her which forms to file, which officials to petition. The school had eventually gotten its repairs. Since then, they'd developed an unlikely friendship. They were both outsiders in their own ways. Benjamin, the quiet clerk who noticed too much. Lydia, the educated black woman who refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose. If anyone would understand why this mattered, it was Lydia. He found her that Saturday afternoon in the school's small library, organizing donated books. She looked up when he entered, surprise crossing her face. "Mr. Walsh, this is unexpected." "Miss Mathis, I apologize for the intrusion. I need to speak with you about something sensitive." Her expression sharpened. "Come in, close the door." Benjamin told her everything. The missing ledger, Judge Harriman's midnight visit, the newspaper accounts of Bellarive, the stranger outside his door. Lydia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she walked to the window and stood there for a long moment, her arms crossed. "My grandmother worked at Bellarive," she said finally. Benjamin felt the air leave his lungs. Her name was Ruth. She was 14 when the war ended. She's 74 now, still alive, still sharp as a blade. Lydia turned to face him. "She doesn't talk about Bellarive. She's never talked about it, not in all my life. But a few times when I was young, I heard her wake up screaming in the night. And once, I heard her say a name, Harriman." The room felt very cold. "Judge Theodore Harriman," Benjamin whispered. "I don't know. She never explained. But, Mr. Walsh, if you're asking me whether something terrible happened at that plantation, something that powerful people want to keep hidden, yes, I believe that absolutely. Will your grandmother talk to me?" Lydia shook her head. "She won't talk to you, but she might talk to me if I ask the right way. Give me time." 3 days later, Lydia came to Benjamin's boarding house. Her face was drawn, her eyes haunted. "My grandmother talked," she said. "You need to hear this." They walked to a small park where they could speak privately. Lydia sat on a bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Bellarive wasn't a plantation in the traditional sense," she began. "Not by the end of the war, anyway. It was something else entirely. My grandmother said that starting in 1863, it became a kind of experiment." "What kind of experiment?" "The owners, and my grandmother said there were multiple owners, powerful men from New Orleans and as far away as Richmond. They had a theory. They believed that slavery was evolving, that after the war, legal ownership might end, but economic control could continue. So they started making agreements." Benjamin leaned forward. "What kind of agreements?" "They told enslaved people at Bellarive that they could earn their freedom and land. If they worked, if they increased production, if they met certain quotas, they would be given deeds to parcels of the plantation after the war. Everything was documented. Names, hours worked, production levels. My grandmother said there was a man who came once a month, a man in a dark suit who recorded everything in a leather book. She remembers him very clearly. He had red hair and a scar on his left hand. Why would slaveholders offer this? Because they knew the war was lost. They were looking ahead. If slavery ended but they still controlled the land, and if the former enslaved people owed them money, earned through this system but never quite enough to fully own their parcels, then they could keep those people bound to the plantation through debt instead of chains. It was capitalism dressed up as charity." Benjamin felt sick, but the people at Bellarive didn't know this. Some suspected. But what choice did they have? Work with no promise of anything, or work with a chance at freedom and land? They worked. God, my grandmother said they worked like nothing you've ever seen. They believed. What happened? Lydia's voice dropped. May 1865. Union soldiers came to Bellarive. The war was over. The enslaved people presented their claims. They had records of their work, verbal promises from the overseers. But when the soldiers asked to see the official documentation, the ledger where everything was recorded, it couldn't be found. The man with the red hair had vanished. The main owner, my grandmother said his name was Pritchard, claimed no such agreements existed. He said the enslaved people were confused, desperate, making up stories. But there were witnesses. The agreements were public knowledge on the plantation. The testimony of enslaved people against white men? Mr. Walsh, you know how that worked. The case went to court in 1867. The people from Bellerive tried to prove their claims. But without the ledger, without documentation, they had nothing the court would accept. Judge Victor Lansfield ruled against them. Benjamin's mind raced. And Judge Harriman? Lydia met his eyes. My grandmother said Theodore Harriman was one of the owners. He was younger then, not yet a judge. He was a lawyer representing the consortium that purchased Bellerive in 1859. She remembered him because he came to the plantation 3 times. Once in 1859 during the purchase, once in 1864 to inspect operations, and once in April 1865, right before the surrender. That final visit, my grandmother saw him burning papers in the plantation office, stacks and stacks of papers. She was bringing water to the main house and saw him through the window. Benjamin stood up, his legs unsteady. The pieces were connecting now, forming a devastating picture. The ledger survived the burning, he said slowly. Somehow it ended up in the courthouse records. Maybe it was filed away by mistake. Maybe someone saved it deliberately. But it existed all these years, forgotten. And now, with talk of renewed investigations into Reconstruction-era fraud, with the federal government finally looking into cases where freed people were cheated out of land claims. Someone remembered the ledger, Lydia finished. Someone realized it was still out there, documentation that could destroy reputations, implicate powerful families in fraud. So they sent Judge Harriman to make it disappear. Who else was involved? You said multiple owners. My grandmother remembered some names. Pritchard, he was the primary owner, a man named Desmond Carlyle from New Orleans, Senator James Vaughan, and 2 others she only heard mentioned, Fitch and Hargrove. Benjamin felt the ground shift beneath him. Senator Vaughan's son was now the governor. The Carlyle family owned the largest bank in 3 states. Hargrove was the name of the current state attorney general. These weren't just powerful families. These were dynasties. Benjamin knew what he had to do. He had to find evidence that Judge Harriman had destroyed the ledger, and he had to find proof of what was in it before it disappeared. But the courthouse was now dangerous. After the stranger's visit, Benjamin had no doubt he was being watched. If he started asking questions directly, he would be stopped. Or worse, he needed to be clever. He remembered something Miss Duchamps had mentioned. The Confederate Treasury investigation in 1863. If the Treasury Department had investigated Bellerive, there should be a report somewhere. Most Confederate records had been captured by Union forces and eventually archived. The question was where. He spent his lunch hour at the telegraph office and sent inquiries to archives in Washington, D.C., Baton Rouge, and Atlanta. He identified himself as a courthouse clerk conducting research for historical documentation, which was technically true, if misleading. 3 weeks passed. Benjamin continued his normal duties, careful not to show any unusual interest in old records. He felt eyes on him constantly, though he couldn't identify who was watching. Then, in early May, he received a response from the National Archives in Washington. Records of Confederate Treasury investigations, Mississippi District 1863-1864, are held in Series M347, Rolls 82-83. A report dated November 1863 concerning Bellerive Plantation exists, but is currently restricted from public access pending review by the War Department. Request for access must be submitted with appropriate governmental authorization. Restricted? Of course it was restricted. But now Benjamin knew the report existed. Whatever the Treasury Department had found about Bellerive had been serious enough to warrant continued secrecy, or continued suppression, 30 years later. He took this information to Lydia. She read the telegram, her expression grim. "We need someone with federal authority," she said. "Someone outside the local power structure who can request these documents. Do you know anyone like that?" Lydia thought for a moment. "There's a lawyer in Jackson. His name is Robert Parrish. He works for the Justice Department on Reconstruction fraud cases. He's been investigating land theft across the South. If anyone would care about this, can you contact him?" "I can try." While Lydia worked on contacting Robert Parrish, Benjamin decided to take a different approach. If the ledger was gone, were there other records that might contain information about Bellarive's ownership? He began searching through deed transfers, tax records, probate files, anything from the 1855-1870 period that might mention the plantation. He was careful to do this during normal working hours, always with a plausible excuse for why he needed to access old files. What he found was illuminating. In 1859, when the private investors purchased Bellarive, no names were recorded on the deed transfer. Instead, it listed a legal entity, the Delta Agricultural Investment Trust. Benjamin had never heard of this trust. He searched for other records mentioning it. Nothing. The trust appeared only once in the entire courthouse archive, on the Bellarive purchase deed. It was as if the organization had been created solely for this transaction. But trusts had to be established somewhere. They had to have legal documentation, articles of formation, registered agents. Benjamin spent his evening at the law library, researching Mississippi trust law from the 1850s. What he learned was that trusts could be established in any county, and their records were kept by the chancery clerk of that county. The Bellarive deed had been filed in Harrison County, but that didn't mean the trust itself had been established there. The next day, Benjamin sent inquiries to every chancery clerk's office within 200 miles, asking if they had records of the Delta Agricultural Investment Trust, established around 1859. He received responses over the next 2 weeks, all negative, until the letter from Lafayette County arrived. Yes, we have articles of trust for Delta Agricultural Investment Trust, filed June 1859. However, these records are currently unavailable for review, as they are being used in ongoing legal proceedings. Inquiries should be directed to ongoing legal proceedings. Benjamin's heart raced. Who was suing whom? He didn't get a chance to find out. That night, the courthouse burned. The fire started around midnight in the records room. By the time neighbors saw the flames and raised the alarm, half the building was engulfed. Benjamin, sleeping fitfully in his boarding house, was awakened by church bells ringing frantically. He pulled on his clothes and ran toward the courthouse, arriving as volunteer firefighters struggled to control the blaze. He stood in the street, watching smoke pour from the windows of the records room, and felt a crushing sense of defeat. Everything, decades of documents, property records, marriage certificates, wills, deeds, all of it was being consumed. Mr. Pitts appeared beside him, his face smudged with soot. "It's gone," he said hollowly. "All of it. 30 years of records. Just gone." "How did it start?" Benjamin asked. Pitts shook his head. "Sheriff thinks maybe a lamp left burning. Old building, lots of paper. These things happen. These things happen." Benjamin repeated. The words felt hollow. By dawn, the fire was out. The courthouse was a smoking shell. Officials stood in clusters, discussing reconstruction plans, salvage operations, insurance claims. Benjamin walked carefully through the debris, accompanied by a sheriff's deputy. The records room was utterly destroyed. Charred fragments of documents littered the floor, but nothing was readable. Nothing had survived. He was staring at what had been Section K, where the plantation records were stored, when he saw it. A footprint in the ash, fresh, distinct, leading away from the center of the burn pattern toward the window. Benjamin knelt down, studying it. The fire had started in the records room, but this footprint was on top of the ash, not beneath it. Someone had been in here after the fire started, or had set it and then walked through the destruction. "Deputy," Benjamin called, "look at this." The deputy came over, glanced at the footprint, then shrugged. "Probably one of the firefighters." "The firefighters came through the main door. This is on the opposite side of the room." "Well, I don't know, Walsh. Could be anything. We're all tramping through here now, assessing damage." But Benjamin saw the truth in the deputy's eyes. The man didn't want to investigate. He didn't want to ask uncomfortable questions, because everyone in Harrison County already knew who didn't want this fire investigated. Robert Parrish arrived in Harrison County on a warm May afternoon, 3 days after the fire. He was a tall man in his early 40s with graying temples and the kind of calm, methodical demeanor that suggested he'd seen too much to be easily shocked. Lydia had arranged a meeting in a small church on the edge of town. Benjamin sat in a pew beside her, watching Parrish review the timeline they'd prepared. Everything from the missing ledger to Ruth's testimony to the fire. When he finished reading, Parrish set the papers down and looked at them both for a long moment. "This is a strong case circumstantially," he said. "But you understand we need evidence. Actual documentation. Testimony from Ruth alone won't be enough. She was a child during the events in question, and her account would be easily dismissed by defense attorneys. The ledger is gone. The courthouse records are destroyed. The Treasury report is restricted. What you have here is a compelling story, but stories don't hold up in federal court." "So what do we do?" Lydia asked. "We need to find the people behind the trust. If we can prove that current officials, specifically Judge Harriman, were partners in a fraudulent scheme to cheat freed people out of land, we can bring charges. But we need records, financial records, correspondence, witness testimony from people who worked at Bellerive and can identify the owners." "My grandmother can identify Judge Harriman," Lydia said. "So can others who worked there. That establishes his presence at the plantation, but not his legal connection to the ownership. We need documents that link him to the Delta Agricultural Investment Trust. We need proof that the trust was specifically created to facilitate fraud." Benjamin spoke up. "Lafayette County has the trust's formation documents. They said they were being used in ongoing legal proceedings. Do you have authority to access those?" Parrish nodded slowly. "I can requisition them as part of a federal investigation. But once I do that, everyone will know we're building a case. The people involved, if they're as powerful as you suggest, will close ranks. They'll destroy whatever remaining evidence exists. They'll threaten witnesses. They'll use every legal and extra-legal method to stop this investigation. So we need to move fast," Benjamin said. "We need to move carefully," Parrish corrected. "But yes, fast." He stood up. "I'm going to Lafayette County tomorrow. In the meantime, you two need to be very, very careful. Do not discuss this with anyone. Do not take any unusual actions. If you're being watched, and I suspect you are, give them no reason to escalate." Lydia's grandmother Ruth agreed to speak with Robert Parrish, but only on one condition. The conversation had to take place in her home, with Lydia present, and Parrish could take no notes during their meeting. "What I tell you is the truth," Ruth said when Parrish arrived at her small house on the outskirts of town. "But the truth is dangerous. I will not have my words written down where they can be used to hurt my family." "I understand," Parrish said. Ruth Mathis was a small woman, her face deeply lined, her eyes sharp and evaluating. She sat in a rocking chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, and spoke in a calm, measured voice that carried the weight of decades of careful survival. "I was born at Bellerive in 1851, she began. "My mother was named Alice. My father, I don't know. That wasn't unusual. We worked the fields, the regular work, until 1863. That's when things changed. A white man came to the plantation that spring. He gathered us all, about 60 of us in the yard, and gave a speech. He said the war was changing things. He said smart people understood that the future wouldn't look like the past. He offered us a deal. Work hard, he said. Meet quotas. Produce more cotton than we'd produced the year before. Do this, and when the war ended, we'd be given land. 5 acres per family. He said it would be legal, documented, proper. He said we'd be landowners. We knew he might be lying, but we also knew we had no other options. So we worked. God, we worked. From before sunrise to after dark, we met the quotas. We exceeded them. Every month a man came to record our production. He had red hair, pale skin, a scar on his left hand. Here, Ruth touched the back of her left hand. He wrote everything in a leather book. Names, hours, yields. He was very precise. I remember 4 men who came to inspect during those years. One was named Pritchard. He owned the place officially. One was named Carlyle. He came from New Orleans. One was older, silver-haired, talked like a politician. and one was young, maybe 30, a lawyer. That was Harriman. You're certain it was Theodore Harriman? Parrish asked gently. I didn't know his first name then, but when he became a judge years later, I saw his picture in the newspaper. It was him. Same face, same way of talking, smooth, confident, like the world was his to arrange. Ruth continued. April 1865. The surrender came. Union soldiers arrived at Bellerive. We told them about the agreements. We told them everything was documented. But Pritchard denied it all. Said we were making it up. The leather book was gone. The man with the red hair was gone. No documentation existed except our word. And Judge Lansfield ruled against you. Judge Lansfield said he sympathized, but the law required documentation. Without written evidence, he couldn't grant our claims. So Bellerive was sold. The land was divided among new buyers, all of them friends of the original owners, we later learned. And we got nothing. Ruth's voice hardened. But I will tell you this, Mr. Parrish. That leather book existed. I saw it. So did dozens of others. And when Judge Harriman came to the plantation in April 1865, I saw him through the office window, burning papers. Stacks of them. He burned for hours. Whatever was in that courthouse ledger, whatever Judge Harriman destroyed last month, that was evidence. Evidence that powerful men created a fraud, that they promised freedom and land to desperate people, that they documented these promises and then destroyed the documentation when the war ended. They trapped us twice, once in slavery, once in lies. The room was silent. Parrish finally spoke. Mrs. Mathis, would you be willing to testify to this in federal court? Ruth looked at her granddaughter. Lydia took her hand. If you can protect my family, Ruth said quietly. Yes, I'll testify. Parrish traveled to Lafayette County with a federal requisition order. The chancery clerk, a nervous man named Edmund Price, led him to a storage room where trust documents were archived. The Delta Agricultural Investment Trust, Price said, pulling a folder from a shelf. Yes, here it is. Filed June 17, 1859. But as I mentioned, it's currently involved in litigation. Federal investigation supersedes local litigation, Parrish said firmly. I need to see those documents. Price handed over the folder reluctantly. Parrish opened it and began to read. What he found exceeded his hopes. The trust had been established by 5 men, each contributing equal capital. Josiah Pritchard, primary landholder. Desmond Carlyle, New Orleans financier. James Vaughan, Mississippi State Senator. Arnold Fitch, cotton merchant. Theodore Harriman, attorney at law. There it was, Judge Harriman's name in black ink on legal documents establishing ownership of Bellerive Plantation. But the documents revealed something else, something Parrish found even more damning. The trust's stated purpose was to develop experimental agricultural practices and labor management systems adaptable to anticipated post-war economic conditions. Labor management systems adaptable to post-war conditions they had been planning from the beginning. This wasn't opportunistic fraud, it was calculated, deliberate strategy. And there was more. Attached to the formation documents were amendments, filed yearly from 1859 through 1867. These amendments detailed profit distributions, capital improvements, and, most crucially, labor incentive programs implemented 1863. The labor incentive programs, the false promises, all documented in the trust's own records. Parrish carefully copied every page, his hand steady despite his racing heart. This was evidence. This was proof. Mr. Price, he said when he finished, I'm placing these documents under federal seal. They are evidence in an ongoing investigation. No one is to access them without authorization from the Justice Department. Is that clear? Price nodded, his face pale. Yes, sir. Parrish knew he had hours, maybe less, before word reached Harrison County that he'd found the trust documents. He needed to move quickly. Benjamin first sensed something was wrong when he arrived at his boarding house that evening and found his landlady, Mrs. Keene, waiting for him in the front hall. Mr. Walsh, I need to speak with you privately. In her parlor, Mrs. Keene wrung her hands and avoided his eyes. "I've been told, that is, some important people have expressed concerns about your behavior. They say you've been involving yourself in matters that don't concern you, making accusations. Who told you this?" "I can't say, but I was advised that having you as a tenant might complicate things for me. My husband's business depends on certain relationships. I'm sorry, Mr. Walsh, but I need you to find other accommodations by the end of the week." Benjamin felt anger and fear mixing in his chest. "I've lived here for 8 years without a single problem. You're evicting me because someone pressured you. Please understand, I understand perfectly." He packed that night. He had nowhere to go, so he slept in the courthouse basement, or what remained of it after the fire. It wasn't comfortable, but it was private. Lydia faced similar pressure. She was called to a meeting with the school board, where she was informed that community members had raised concerns about her outside activities and whether they were appropriate for someone in her position. "Are you dismissing me?" Lydia asked. "Not yet," the board chairman said carefully. "But we wanted to make you aware of these concerns. Teaching is a position of trust, Miss Mattis. We hope you'll consider the example you're setting for your students. The threat was clear. Step back, or lose your livelihood." That evening, Lydia met Benjamin in the burned-out courthouse basement. In the dim light of a single lantern, they sat among the ruins and made a decision. "They're trying to scare us into silence," Lydia said. "It means we're close to something they can't afford to have exposed." "Parrish has the trust documents," Benjamin said. "That proves Judge Harriman was an owner. Combined with Ruth's testimony, it proves he owned the plantation. But does it prove he destroyed the ledger? Does it prove fraud?" Benjamin shook his head slowly. "Not directly. We need more. We need someone who was part of the conspiracy to break, to confess, to provide testimony about what really happened. Who would do that? Everyone involved has too much to lose." "Not everyone," Benjamin said. "What about the man with the red hair? The one who kept the ledger? Ruth said he disappeared in 1865, but that doesn't mean he's dead. If we could find him..." Lydia's eyes widened. "He would have kept records. If he was that meticulous about the ledger, he might have kept copies, notes, something. How do we find him? We don't even know his name." "Ruth saw him monthly for 2 years. She might remember something, a detail, an accent, anything that could help identify him." Ruth remembered more than she'd initially revealed. When Lydia and Parrish returned to ask specific questions about the red-haired man, Ruth closed her eyes and reached back through decades of memory. "His name was Collins," she said finally. "I heard Mr. Pritchard call him that once." "Collins? Have you finished the entries?" "Something like that. First name? Never heard it, but he had an accent. Not southern, northern maybe. Clipped way of talking. Anything else?" Ruth opened her eyes. "He was afraid. I saw it in the way he worked. He kept those ledgers like they were precious things, but also dangerous things, like a man carrying dynamite. And the last time I saw him, April 1865, he looked terrified. He left in the middle of the night. Someone said he took a horse without permission. He just vanished." Parrish made notes. "Collins, northern accent, disappeared April 1865. That's something to work with." Over the next week, Parrish used his Justice Department resources to search for any man named Collins who might have worked as a plantation clerk or accountant in Mississippi between 1863 and 1865. He contacted archives, checked Confederate military records, reviewed census data. Finally, in early June, he found a lead. A man named Raymond Collins had worked for the Confederate Treasury Department as an agricultural inspector from 1862 to 1864. His job was to audit plantations for tax compliance. In March 1865, his employment had ended abruptly. Resigned, no explanation given. Census records showed Raymond Collins had moved to Tennessee after the war. Parrish traced him through property records and voter registrations. The trail went cold in 1876. No, wait. There was a death certificate. Raymond Collins had died in Nashville in 1889, at age 53. Parrish's heart sank. Dead. The key witness was dead. But then he noticed something else in the Tennessee records. Raymond Collins had been married. His widow, Helen Collins, was still alive. She lived in Memphis. Parrish took the train to Memphis. Helen Collins was a woman in her 60s, living in a modest home near the river. When Parrish explained who he was and why he'd come, she studied him for a long moment before inviting him inside. "Raymond died 2 years ago," she said. "He never talked much about the war years, but toward the end when he was sick he talked more, said he had secrets that weighed on him." "Did he ever mention Bellerive Plantation?" Helen's face went pale. "How do you know about that?" "I'm investigating fraud that occurred there." "Your husband kept records for the plantation, didn't he?" Helen nodded slowly. "He did, and it haunted him. Mr. Parrish, my husband was not a bad man. He was young during the war, 24 when he started working for the Treasury Department. He thought he was doing important work, making sure plantations weren't cheating on taxes, that the government got its fair share to fund the war effort. But at Bellerive, he discovered something else. The owners were running a scheme. They were promising enslaved people land and freedom in exchange for increased production, documenting these promises, but never intending to honor them. Raymond documented everything in his official reports. He sent them to the Treasury Department in Richmond. What happened to those reports? Nothing. The Treasury Department ignored them. Later, Raymond learned why. Senator Vaughn had connections in Richmond. The reports were buried, but Raymond kept copies. He kept meticulous copies of everything. Parrish leaned forward. "Does his documentation still exist?" Helen stood and walked to a closet. She pulled out a wooden box, weathered and locked. She opened it with a small key she wore around her neck. Inside were ledgers, 3 of them, bound in leather, filled with careful handwriting. "Raymond kept these his whole life," Helen said quietly. "He said someday they might matter. He said someday someone might care about the truth." Parrish opened the first ledger. It was a copy of the records Raymond Collins had kept at Bellerive. Every enslaved person's name, every hour worked, every promise made. The second ledger contained copies of letters between the trust owners, discussing the labor incentive program and how to maximize production while minimizing actual land transfers. The third ledger was the most damning. It contained a day-by-day account of April 1865, Raymond Collins' final month at Bellerive. April 15th, 1865. "Pritchard informed me that the agreements with laborers will not be honored. War is lost. No legal requirement to transfer land. I objected. He threatened dismissal." April 18th, 1865. "Harriman arrived today, met with Pritchard privately. Afterward, Pritchard instructed me to prepare full accounting of all promises made, all documentation created. Said it was for legal purposes." April 22nd, 1865. "Harriman and Pritchard reviewed my ledgers. Harriman said they were problematic. Asked me to turn over all copies. I refused. Harriman became threatening, said I would be held responsible for inciting insurrection among the laborers if I disclosed the contents. I told him the records were truthful accounting. He said truth was not the issue. Stability was." April 25th, 1865. "I fear for my safety. 2 men have been watching my quarters. Tonight, I saw Harriman burning papers in the main office, stacks of documents, correspondence, agreements, ledgers. He is destroying evidence. I have decided to leave. I will take my copies and depart before they force me to surrender them or worse." April 27th, 1865. "Left Bellerive at midnight. Took horse and rode to Vicksburg. Will resign from Treasury position. Cannot be part of this fraud. Will keep these records in hopes that someday justice might be possible." Parrish sat back, his hands trembling slightly. This was it. This was everything. "Mrs. Collins, would you be willing to allow these ledgers to be used as evidence in a federal investigation?" Helen looked at the ledgers, then at Parrish. "Raymond wanted the truth known, but he also wanted me to be safe. If I give you these, what happens to me? You'll be protected. I can arrange federal protection, relocation if necessary, But I cannot lie to you. This will be dangerous. The people involved are powerful." Helen took a deep breath. "My husband carried this burden for 24 years. He died never seeing justice done. If these records can finally accomplish what he could not, then yes, use them." Robert Parrish returned to Harrison County with copies of Raymond Collins's ledgers. He immediately filed a formal complaint with the U.S. District Court in Jackson, Mississippi. The complaint named Judge Theodore Harriman and identified him as a founding member of the Delta Agricultural Investment Trust, a participant in fraudulent labor practices at Bellerive Plantation, responsible for destroying evidence in April 1865, responsible for destroying courthouse records in April 1891. The charges included conspiracy to defraud, destruction of government documents, and violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1875. When word reached Harrison County, the response was swift and fierce. Judge Harriman immediately resigned from the bench, citing health concerns. His attorney released a statement denying all allegations and announcing intention to fight the charges vigorously. The Carlisle family issued a statement expressing shock and dismay at allegations involving their late patriarch, while noting that they had no direct knowledge of his business dealings at Bellerive. Governor Vaughan, son of James Vaughan, released a carefully worded statement saying his father had been a minority investor in a legitimate agricultural business and any improper actions by other partners were unknown to the family. But the evidence was overwhelming. And critically, Parrish had built a case that didn't rely solely on the testimony of formerly enslaved people, though their testimony was powerful. He had Raymond Collins's meticulous documentation, legal records from the trust formation, and a clear timeline of deliberate fraud and cover-up. In July 1891, Judge Theodore Harriman was indicted by a federal grand jury. The trial began in September 1891 in the federal courthouse in Jackson. The courtroom was packed every day, journalists from as far as New York and Boston, curious citizens, descendants of people who had worked at Bellerive. Benjamin Walsh and Lydia Mattis sat in the public gallery, watching as the prosecution laid out its case. Parrish was the lead prosecutor, and he was methodical, relentless. First, he established the formation of the trust and Harriman's role as a founding member. The Lafayette County documents made this indisputable. Then he called Ruth Mattis to the stand. Ruth testified for 3 hours. She described the promises made in 1863, the work done, the monthly visits by Raymond Collins, the ledgers. She described seeing Harriman burn documents in April 1865. Her testimony was calm, detailed, unshakable. Harriman's defense attorney cross-examined her aggressively, trying to suggest her memory was faulty, that she was confused, that she held a grudge against wealthy white families. But Ruth simply repeated her testimony, adding small details each time. The weather on specific days, the color of Collins's jacket, the exact words Pritchard had used when making the initial promises. The jury listened in absolute silence. Next, Parrish introduced Raymond Collins's ledgers. He read excerpts describing the labor incentive program, the false promises, the deliberate plan to avoid honoring agreements. He read Collins's account of April 1865, of Harriman burning documents, of the threats against Collins himself. Helen Collins testified about her husband's fear, his determination to preserve the truth, his death carrying the weight of secrets. The defense argued that Collins was a disgruntled employee, that his ledgers were falsified, that there was no proof Harriman had destroyed the courthouse records in 1891. But then, Parrish played his final card. He called Mr. Gerald Pitts, Benjamin's supervisor at the courthouse. Pitts was a reluctant witness. He squirmed on the stand, sweating despite the cool autumn air. Parrish walked him through the night log from April 13, 1891, establishing that Judge Harriman had accessed the Bellerive ledger at midnight and that the ledger had subsequently vanished. Mr. Pitts, when Mr. Walsh brought this discrepancy to your attention, what did you tell him? Pitts hesitated. I told him Judge Harriman was conducting research for a case. What case? I don't know. Was there a case involving Bellerive Plantation in April 1891? No. So you lied to Mr. Walsh. I was protecting Judge Harriman's privacy. You were covering up the destruction of evidence. Who told you to discourage Mr. Walsh's inquiries? Pitts looked at the judge, at the jury, at the packed courtroom. His voice dropped to a whisper. Judge Harriman came to see me on April 14th. He said the Bellerive matter was sensitive, that it involved old allegations that had been settled years ago, that it would be best if the missing ledger was not discussed. He said my cooperation would be remembered when county positions were being filled. He bribed you. He suggested there would be benefits to discretion. The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order. The defense tried to salvage the situation, but the damage was done. The jury had heard a courthouse official admit to suppressing evidence at Harriman's direction. The final testimony came from a surprise witness, Arnold Fitch. Fitch was 73 years old, one of the original trust members. He was dying. Everyone could see it in his gaunt face, his labored breathing. Parrish had found him in New Orleans and convinced him that he had nothing left to lose by telling the truth. Fitch testified that the entire Bellerive scheme had been Harriman's idea. Harriman, the young lawyer, had argued that slavery was ending and intelligent men would adapt. The trust, the false promises, the documentation that was never meant to be honored, all of it had been Harriman's design. He said we'd be millionaires, Fitch rasped. Said the laborers would work themselves to exhaustion for the promise of land. And when the war ended, we'd have increased production and no obligation to transfer property. He said it was the future of Southern agriculture. And when the war ended, Harriman burned everything, made Collins run away, bought off Judge Lansfield to rule against the claims. He was thorough. He thought of everything. Except Collins kept copies. And except all of us, we knew the truth. We lived with it for 26 years. And it's killed us slowly, not legally, but in here. Fitch tapped his chest. That guilt never leaves. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Theodore Harriman guilty on all counts. Judge Theodore Harriman was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The sentence was considered harsh by some, lenient by others. Harriman was 57 years old. 15 years meant he would likely die in prison. At the sentencing, the judge, a federal appointee from Ohio, carefully selected to ensure impartiality, spoke directly to Harriman. You were entrusted with the law. You were educated, privileged, given every advantage. And you used your intelligence not to seek justice, but to perpetrate one of the most calculated frauds I have encountered. You exploited desperate people, made false promises to those who had no power to demand accountability, and then spent decades ensuring the truth remained hidden. The law you claimed to serve was betrayed by your actions. This court cannot undo the harm you caused. We cannot restore the land that should have been given to the people of Bellerive. We cannot compensate them for 26 years of injustice. But we can make clear that such actions will not be tolerated, that destroying evidence and using power to suppress truth carries consequences. Harriman stood silently, his face expressionless. He was taken to federal prison in Indiana. He would serve 9 years before dying of pneumonia in 1900. The other trust members faced various consequences. Desmond Carlisle's estate was sued by descendants of Bellerive workers, resulting in a settlement. Governor Vaughan was not charged criminally. His father had died in 1878, and there was insufficient evidence of the governor's personal involvement. But the scandal severely damaged his political career. Arnold Fitch died 3 weeks after the trial ended. In the months following the trial, Benjamin Walsh found himself unexpectedly celebrated. Newspapers called him the clerk who wouldn't let go, the man who exposed a judge's crimes. He received job offers from courthouses across the country. He turned them all down. Instead, he stayed in Harrison County and helped rebuild the courthouse record system. He implemented new protocols for document security, for access logging, for preservation. He became deputy clerk, then chief clerk. He never forgot that his persistence had nearly cost him everything. But he also never forgot that persistence had mattered. Lydia Mattis continued teaching. The school board's concerns evaporated once the trial concluded and public opinion shifted. She became principal of the Harrison County School for Colored Children in 1897 and held the position for 23 years. She and Benjamin remained friends their entire lives. They met monthly for coffee, discussing books, politics, and the slow, frustrating progress toward justice. Ruth Mathis lived to see the trial's conclusion. She died in 1893 at 78 years old. At her funeral, Lydia read from Raymond Collins's ledger, the entries listing Ruth's name, her work, her promised 5 acres. She never got her land, Lydia said, but she got her truth told. And sometimes when justice is slow, truth has to be enough to start with. The Bellerive case established legal precedent. Federal courts began reviewing other Reconstruction-era land fraud cases with renewed scrutiny. While many claims were too old to prosecute, some resulted in civil settlements. It wasn't full justice, but it was acknowledgement. It was recognition that crimes had been committed, that people had been cheated, that the historical record needed correction. Robert Parrish continued his work with the Justice Department. He investigated dozens of similar cases across the South. Few resulted in criminal convictions. The Bellerive case was exceptional in its documentation. But his work helped push Congress to establish compensation programs for proven land fraud victims. As for the question that started everything, why Judge Harriman chose April 1891 to destroy the ledger, the answer came during the trial. Congress had been considering a new round of Reconstruction claims investigations. A committee was planning to review old cases where freed people had been denied land they'd been promised. Bellerive was on a list of plantations flagged for re-examination. Someone, likely someone with government connections, warned the surviving trust members that their case might be reopened. Harriman, the only one with access to the last remaining documentation, took action. He almost got away with it. He would have gotten away with it if not for a clerk who noticed a discrepancy in a logbook, if not for a librarian who remembered an old story, if not for a grandmother who was willing to finally speak, if not for a widow who preserved her husband's careful records for 24 years. In 1895, Benjamin Walsh was cataloging newly reconstructed courthouse records when he found something interesting. Tucked into a property file was a fragment of a document, a corner of a page, partially burned, that had somehow survived the courthouse fire. The fragment contained only a few words. Transfer of land parcels to the following named individuals upon satisfaction of labor obligations as documented herein. Ruth Mathis, 5 acres, Section 14. It was a piece of the original Bellerive agreement. Proof that the promises had been real, had been documented, had existed. Benjamin held the fragment carefully. He could have publicized it, used it to strengthen the historical record. Instead, he placed it in an envelope, wrote "Evidence of Truth" on the outside, and gave it to Lydia. Lydia showed it to her grandmother Ruth, who held the fragile paper in her weathered hands and cried. "We weren't crazy," Ruth whispered. "We weren't making it up. It was real." That fragment is now preserved in the archives of the Mississippi Department of History. Historians who have examined it confirm its authenticity. It remains one of the few physical pieces of evidence from the Bellerive labor agreement program. But questions remain. Questions that will never be fully answered. How many other plantations ran similar schemes? How many other labor incentive programs existed during the final years of the war, promising freedom and land to desperate people, then destroying the documentation when those promises became inconvenient? How many other ledgers were destroyed? How many other clerks fled into the night carrying secrets? How many other judges and officials spent decades protecting powerful families and their dark legacies? The Bellerive case was one of the few where the truth emerged, but it emerged only because of unlikely coincidences, persistent individuals, and a widow who kept her husband's ledgers in a locked box for 24 years. How many truths didn't emerge? How many are still buried, still protected, still hidden behind the names of respectable families and the sealed records of forgotten courthouses? The Bellerive plantation itself is gone now. The land was divided, sold, developed. Houses sit where cotton fields once stretched. A church occupies what was once the main plantation house's footprint. There is no historical marker, no monument to the 60 people who worked there, who believed promises, who were cheated. The official records were destroyed twice, once by Harriman in 1865, once in the courthouse fire of 1891. But the truth survived, imperfectly, incompletely, but survived. And that has to matter. Because if one carefully kept ledger could eventually expose decades of lies, if one persistent clerk could unravel a conspiracy, if one elderly woman's testimony could force powerful men to finally face consequences, then maybe, just maybe, the truth always leaves traces. The question is whether anyone notices, whether anyone cares enough to follow those traces, whether anyone is willing to risk comfort and safety to pursue justice for people they never knew, for crimes committed before they were born. Benjamin Walsh was such a person. So was Lydia Mathis. So was Raymond Collins, fleeing into the night with his copies, hoping someday they might matter. They did matter. But how many other copies are still out there, still waiting in locked boxes and forgotten attics, still holding secrets about other plantations, other judges, other families who destroyed records linking them to crimes they never wanted acknowledged? The Bellerive case asked one question: what was in that ledger? But it raised another, deeper question. How much of history is missing, not because time erased it, but because someone deliberately destroyed it? And that is the question we can never fully answer. We can only keep searching, keep asking, keep refusing to let silence be the final word. The records room at the Harrison County Courthouse was rebuilt in 1892. Benjamin Walsh designed it with reinforced doors, fireproof cabinets, and a logging system so meticulous that no document could ever disappear without a trace. But in courthouses across the South, in basements and attics and storage rooms, countless records still sit in ordinary file cabinets, vulnerable to fire, theft, deliberate destruction. History is fragile. Truth is fragile. Both require vigilance. Judge Theodore Harriman spent his final years in prison maintaining his innocence. He wrote letters to newspapers claiming he'd been falsely accused, that the trial had been political theater, that the evidence had been fabricated. Some people believed him, some still do. That's how power works. Even when defeated, even when proven guilty, it insists on its innocence. It rewrites the narrative. It makes doubt seem reasonable. But the evidence remains. Raymond Collins's ledgers are archived. Ruth Mathis's testimony is part of the court record. The fragment of the original agreement exists. The truth survived. This time, the events described in this account are based on trial records, archived documents, and testimony preserved in the U.S. District Court Case United States versus Theodore Harriman, 1891. The Bellerive Plantation existed, the labor incentive fraud occurred, and Judge Harriman was convicted and imprisoned. But the story raises questions that extend far beyond one plantation, one judge, one destroyed ledger. How many similar cases never reached trial? How many other documents were successfully destroyed? How many powerful families still carry secrets about their origins, about the source of their wealth, about the people who were exploited to build their legacies? Those questions have no definitive answers. We can only keep asking them. And we can honor the memory of people like Benjamin Walsh, Lydia Mathis, Ruth and Raymond Collins. Ordinary people who chose extraordinary courage in pursuit of truth. The records they preserved, the testimony they gave, the risks they took. These are fragile shields against deliberate forgetting. But sometimes fragile shields are enough. Sometimes the truth survives. And when it does, it demands our attention.